welcome. We want to get underway. Please do come in and find a seat, and we will begin our briefing. My name is Phil Bond. I am a board member of the TechAmerica Foundation, and my purpose here today is to welcome each of our guests from the press and from government and from the companies and others who have been part of this effort, and also to welcome, at least give a word of welcome to our satellite simulcast going on today in Richardson, Texas, at VCE offices there, and at the offices of Brocade in San Jose, California. I want to thank the local commissioners on site in both of those other locations as well for participating, and for our friends from the press who have turned out at those locations. The simulcast reflects not only the great innovation centers in Texas and Silicon Valley that we're plugging into today, but also the reach of this particular commission effort through the TechAmerica Foundation as we reached out to executives and thought leaders around the country. So how did we get to this announcement and release today? I want to start with a word of thanks to the federal CIO, Vivek Kundra, and also to Secretary Gary Lockett, the Commerce Secretary, and Undersecretary Pat Gallagher. It was those leaders in government who encouraged us by saying they wanted ideas from the private sector about how to maintain and enhance U.S. leadership in this exciting new opportunity of the cloud. And so, responding to those leadership requests and leadership interest from those government leaders, we then put out the call that resulted in this announcement today. We responded in a way you'll hear some details about in the briefing today, but let me just share a couple of data points. More than 3,000 man-hours that went into the various reports here, and very often those were woman hours, I would acknowledge too, in terms of some of our leadership. In other words, about 20 months if we had dedicated a single executive to this multifaceted effort. And so today, on behalf of the TechAmerica Foundation, I'm thrilled to announce that we are releasing Cloud First, Cloud Fast, recommendations for innovation, leadership, and job creation. While this is a early draft that we're releasing today, you can find all of the details on our website, techamericafoundation.org/cloud2. Now, I want to point out that Cloud 2 is actually Cloud Squared, because our very clever name was the Commission on Leadership, the leadership opportunity of U.S. deployment of the cloud, or Cloud Squared. We will have a final post-production copy available in about 10 days, and we'll be able to share that with our friends in the press as well, although we have summarized all the findings and the full text available on the web. I referenced a multifaceted effort. We also produced a Cloud Buyer's Guide, and you will find that at cloudbuyersguide.org, full of recommendations. Again, you'll receive a briefing on that today. And I will just note in passing, we'll be back to our friends in the press with some more news in a couple of weeks as we now turn our attention and looking at state and local government through the prism of the cloud and through the prism of these recommendations. You'll be hearing more from us on that. Now it's my job to give you a brief introduction of our leadership that is with us here today to brief you on the report and the Cloud Buyer's Guide. Starting on my left, your right, John Mallory from MIT, where he is a research scientist in the MIT Computer Science and Artificial Intelligence Lab. We have Mike Nelson from Georgetown, visiting professor in Internet Studies there in the Communications, Culture, and Technology program. Dan Reed, Corporate Vice President with Microsoft in the Technology Policy Group. Jim Schaefer, President of CSC North America Public Sector Programs. And unable to be with us today, Mark Benioff, Chairman, CEO, and founder of Salesforce.com, and then leading the discussion here today, our other co-chair of the overall effort, Chairman and CEO of VCE Corporation, Michael Capellas. And Michael, I turn it over to you with thanks.
Well, thank you, and I would like to echo Phil's comments. A very warm welcome to you wherever we may find you, either live or on broadcast. And it goes without saying, we also would like to thank Phil and TechAmerica for their leadership. I can't think of kind of a better day to be kicking off a program which we think has immense potential for to improve our global competitiveness and also for the improvement of government efficiency. So I think our backdrop is actually quite good. A little bit to start off, about 3 months ago at the request, as Phil mentioned, of the Federal Chief Information Officer, Vivek Kundra, and also from the U.S. Department of Commerce, we formed this commission, and I think the reasons were obvious. One is, as we are in the midst of a really very significant technology transition, and I think most of you have followed technology, knows that there is generally a development curve followed by an extremely rapid adoption curve, and we are actually in the middle of one of those adoption curve changes. So as that came about, and we had the opportunity for a very positive move in how we actually improve the efficiency of technologies as it relates to the improvement of our government, and secondarily, a very positive trend to how we can really use technology as a baseline to improve both U.S. Global competitiveness and even extend into the world economy. Our ambitions were extremely ambitious, and I like the word we put, somewhat audacious, and I have had the opportunity to participate in some of these sessions before, and I will tell you, I have never seen one that was able to bring the two factors that are important together. One is deep collaboration among peers, which actually ends up in substance. I've seen us have one, I've seen us have the other, but rarely have I ever seen a commission come up with two. I think one of our reasons why was we set the goal to have very specific practical recommendations to be able to get those on to a very understandable format and to do it quickly. So if you think about some of the undertaking here, over 70 companies, and these are the world-class leaders across the board in technology, more than 300 individual contributors. We started some of our meetings with saying our goal is to put our company interests second and to put the task at hand first. And while we probably said that thousands of times, I have never seen a group work more collaboratively actually do it. Hundreds of meetings over a 3-month period, and again, as you will see, you'll end up with a very practical recommendation. What we're going to go over today is the output of that. You've already heard that it comes in 2 forms. Again, with our spirit of being very practical, one is a buyer's guide, and the second is a report which tends to some longer range policy and also some short-term recommendations on how we can begin immediately to start to drive efficiency through this evolution to cloud technology. So the buyer's guide is where I'd sort of like to kick off, and then I'm certainly going to turn over to my colleagues to pick up on the specific recommendations. The goal here was to set out for those agencies and those federal government institutions that were looking to jumpstart their way into the evolution, a very practical step-by-step guide. I would encourage you to look at www.cloudbuyersguide.org. That was www.cloudbuyersguide.org. Very tricky sort of common sense approach. And what you'll see is case studies, but a really step-by-step process of how to look at a business case, draw it through requirements, how to educate a staff that's having to change their roles, responsibilities, and technical capabilities, and a framework for decision-making. And so when you break it into its 4 components, it is indeed very practical. And if you think about the players that were involved, these are world-class professionals that have been doing this for a very, very, very long time. It's a series of best practices that are aimed also at a broad group of folks, everywhere from the acquisition managers to program managers to chief financial officers. And it does start to take down and address some of the barriers, which is the actual procurement process itself. And so if you actually take a time to go into that work, it is quite pragmatic. You'll also notice that we have put great effort to make this a living, breathing, extensible document. It will continue to be updated at the website, and the initial proposal is simply the beginning of what we think is going to be continuing dialogue, continuing best practices, and again, supported by the best and brightest. I was amazed as I was talking to a bunch of our colleagues, and normally when you go through a process like this is, you hear some people who thought it was a great experience, some people who thought they maybe quite didn't get their point of view, but I will tell you, across the board, everybody who participated thought it was an extraordinary output, but also a very collaborative effort. And I would be remiss without thanking my colleague and longtime associate Mark Benioff for some really heavy lifting on the buyer's guide, as well as some of the others. So that's the buyer's guide. The second part of the report actually gets into report, which is organized over 4 principles and really addresses both policy and practice. You'll find that the report is broken into sections of trust, transnational data flows, transparency, and transformation, each one addressing the kind of structural things that have to happen, again, transforming through policy all the way into practice. Consideration was given to both the needs of people, process, and technology, all which are fundamental to any one of these. They are quite pragmatic. They actually jump into some of the more difficult and complex issues, but at the end of the day, output themselves into 14 recommendations, each one that we believe can be practically implemented. And again, that is the great indication that you have solid output, is that when it can be taken down into pragmatic policy decisions. With that, I would also add that it was absolutely an honor to be associated with all the colleagues and to get into the specifics of the recommendations and, again, the substance part. I'd like to start turning it over to Jim.
Thanks, Michael. Well, as Michael mentioned, we did have more than 70 companies involved who contributed to this commission. And as you can imagine, we had literally hundreds of ideas that were put on the table, and the team did just an absolutely outstanding job of sorting through those ideas, those suggestions, and bucketing them, as Michael said, into 4 areas: trust, transnational data flows, transparency, and transformation. We identified 14 specific recommendations to help government work collaboratively with industry, academia, and other nations to support cloud development, innovation, and growth, and ultimately to deploy it effectively on behalf of the U.S. government to make the government operate cheaper, smarter, and work better. Dan Reed and I are going to tag team the recommendations specifically a bit, and I'll take the first couple that are in the thematic area of trust. And you notice that the concept we use here is trust. There's an awful lot of discussion and talk about security, but the Commission felt very strongly that the whole concept of implementing cloud is about something much broader than security. It's about trust. It's absolutely essential as a first step in accelerating cloud adoption and driving U.S. leadership in cloud innovation that the cloud earn the trust of its users. They have to be confident in the security, the privacy, and the availability of service through the cloud. That will require a combination of factors that include things like transparency of practices, accountability, redundancy, access and connectivity, as well as many others. Trust is essential to cloud adoption and essential to U.S. leadership, and we cannot allow questions or perceptions about trust to hinder or provide excuses to prevent moving to the cloud. So our first recommendation in this area is for enabling trust is developing and implementing security and assurance frameworks. Government and industry need to work together to develop and implement international standardized frameworks for securing, assessing, certifying, and accrediting cloud solutions. We recommend that cloud computing service providers collaborate with the National Institute of Standards and Technology, NIST, relevant associations, and standard bodies around the world to assess and evolve current best practices, standards, metrics, and information sharing to collaboratively deliver a higher level of transparency and trust to consumers and users. Our second recommendation involves identity management. Secure identities are critical to enable user trust in the cloud. We need to accelerate development of private sector-led identity management ecosystem as envisioned by the National Strategy for Trusted Identities in Cyberspace. This ecosystem should facilitate the adoption of strong authentication technologies and enable users to gain secure access to cloud services and websites. Now let me turn over to Dan for the second set of recommendations related to trust.
Thanks, Jim. Let me also offer my thanks to my colleagues on the podium here and also all the other commissioners involved. As Mike noted, it really was a pleasure to work together to produce this report. You know, one of the reasons we're here is because we're excited about the power of the cloud as a transformative force, both for government and for industry, the ability to create nimble services, to operate efficiently, and to create and continue to enable economic competitiveness for the U.S. As Jim said, I want to pick up on the trust recommendations and continue in the spirit that he said, because trust really is, if you think about it, the foundation of our society and all of the mechanisms and processes that it supports. That include security, but it's more than that. It's confidence that the information that you need will be protected and safe, and also its privacy, and as Jim said, its availability. So in that spirit, recommendation 3 about responses to data breaches is a government should enact a national data breach law to clarify breach notification responsibilities and commitments of companies to the customers, and also update and strengthen criminal laws against those who attack computer systems and networks, including cloud computing systems. And if you think about that famous saying of Willie Sutton, the bank robber, about why he robbed banks, that's where the money was. The reason why it's important that we think about IT security and trust in the broad sense is because that's where the data and services are. And so it's important that as inevitable targets of malicious actors, that we work together to define appropriate security responses to respond in kind, just as banks provide security. And so in the spirit of recommending enactment of a national data breach law to clarify notifications, it really is in the spirit of what Jim said before, that timely information drives out fear and it catalyzes rapid responses. In addition, the other aspect of the recommendation is really that those laws governing punishment of those attack computer systems and networks need to be updated to reflect technological advances. And you'll see that theme recur as we talk about subsequent recommendations. The longer-term perspective is related to recommendation 4 about research, namely that government, industry, and academia should develop and execute a joint cloud computing research agenda. The benefits that are accruing today from the cloud services that we see now draw on research that was conducted over a period of many years by both the public and the private sector. And it's important that we continue to sustain that investment to drive those innovations forward. And it means a balance between the short and medium-term research and the practical investments that accrue from industry and the government research investment and the broad set of issues around all aspects of clouds, including security and privacy, to drive those longer-term agendas forward and create those future advantages. The second of the broad areas that the report touches on are issues around transnational data flows. And if one thinks about data, it flows like water. It crosses international, national, and jurisdictional boundaries with ease. And in the internet age, information rarely has a single physical location, and duplication and sharing can occur very quickly and very easily. We also know that different countries, different cultures, and different generations have diverse expectations around the concepts of privacy and security. And that really brings us to recommendation 5, that the U.S. government and industry should promote a comprehensive, technology-neutral privacy framework consistent with commonly accepted privacy and data protection principles based on frameworks such as the OECD principles and the APEC privacy frameworks. Many of our U.S. laws tend to be sector-specific. Think about healthcare privacy, for example, or state-specific, and rationalizing that process at a national level to drive discussion internationally about the international and transnational flow of data, particularly in Europe, is important. U.S. industry and government need to work together to promote comprehensive privacy frameworks if we're going to resolve those differing perspectives and ensure that U.S. companies can be successful in the international market. Recommendation 6 about government law enforcement access to data recommends that the U.S. government should demonstrate leadership in identifying and implementing mechanisms for lawful access by law enforcement or government to data stored in the cloud. And I hark back to something I said before about the rate of technical change and the need to rationalize and update many of our regulatory processes. If you think about timescales, 25 years is an eternity in the information age, and yet the Electronic Communications and Privacy Act, ECPA, was enacted in 1986. And so as we think about the rate of change and its implications, we need to think about how we update those to reflect the realities of the need for law enforcement to gain legitimate access to digital information when many of the laws we currently operate under were written when PCs were rare and cell phones were unknown. In addition, the ongoing dialogue that the State Department and other agencies are engaged in driving discussions around processes for legitimate law enforcement access to government data internationally, we commend those activities and recommend that they continue. Related to the previous recommendation, Recommendation 7, e-discovery and forensics, government and industry should enable effective practices for collecting information from the cloud to meet forensic or e-discovery needs in ways that fully support legal due process while minimizing impact on cloud provider operations. The scale and scope at which cloud data centers operate, often involving tens or hundreds of thousands of servers, hosting a diverse set of workloads and disjoint activities, means that it's important that one provide timely response to those legitimate needs, but also not disrupt other activities that are unrelated to those that are the target of inquiry. And so rationalizing that process is an important aspect, and we encourage that activity to continue, particularly because cloud services shift some of the responsibilities for data management from the customer to the provider. And so rationalizing that engagement between government and industry to define those mechanisms is critical. Recommendation 8 is that the U.S. government should lead by example, that it should demonstrate its willingness to trust cloud computing environments in other countries for appropriate government workloads. We all know that trust and security depend on many factors. Physical location is just one of many. Like shoes, one size does not fit all. And it's important as we think about the services and data that can be hosted in different contexts that we understand and clearly enunciate the security and privacy expectations that are commensurate with those and be able to place those data and services accordingly. If we want other governments to host their data and services operated by U.S. companies and in international data centers, we in the U.S. must demonstrate appropriate willingness to do the same. The next topic relates to transparency. As I said before, one of the things that was really clear in our conversations that occurred over and over again was the notion that knowledge and information drive out fear. The transparency by cloud providers will accelerate the shift to the cloud by addressing many of the primary reasons, in particular that federal agencies and companies don't move to the cloud, namely uncertainty about how systems not in their possession may be managed and fear of being unable to access or move their data. And so Recommendation 9 related to transparency is that industry should publicly disclose information about relevant operational aspects of their cloud services, including portability, interoperability, security, certifications, performance, and reliability. Industry and government should support development of metrics designed to meet the needs of diverse and different user groups, and these metrics should be developed in an open and transparent environment, taking into account the global nature of cloud use. The transition to cloud shifts some of the responsibilities from individual companies and historical providers of services to cloud providers. And to make that work, this partnership work, it's really important that that transparency be clear, that there be mechanisms for the consumers of those services to verify the attributes of the services being operated. Which really brings me to Recommendation 10, that of data portability. The cloud providers should enable portability of user data through documents, tools, and support for agreed upon industry standards and best practices. If you've ever looked at your cassette tapes or VHS movies and wondered about how you migrate them, then you understand data portability that exists at scale in the cloud. And because cloud data is not stored in individual users' possession, we really need for cloud providers to commit to support for enabling portability and movement of data by extensions of best practices and standards associated with that. And with that, let me turn it back to Jim to pick up the rest of the recommendations.
Thanks, Dan. The fourth thematic area is transformation. Cloud computing is a disruptive technology. While it offers benefits to adopters, it also poses challenges to federal agencies and commercial organizations that are trying to adapt to the technological changes that are ushered in by the cloud. Many of the companies represented on the Commission are deeply involved with the federal government in the Cloud First initiatives and the Cloud First strategy in trying to bring cloud computing to government. To realize its benefits, government and industry both need to be open to re-envisioning the role of IT and how it's bought and how it's sold. So in this area, our 4 recommendations, the first 2 are aimed specifically at actions that the federal government can take to facilitate transition to the cloud and remove impediments. By stepping forward as a leader in the adoption of cloud, the government can play a key role in driving innovation, economic growth in the IT industry, and demonstrate that it considers the cloud an important, effective, safe, and secure environment. The final 2 recommendations focus on transformation and infrastructure in the workforce necessary for widespread cloud adoption. So recommendation number 11 involves federal acquisition and budgeting. We believe that agencies need to demonstrate flexibility in adapting procurement models for cloud services, and that Congress and OMB should be open to changing the budget models for the acquisitions of cloud services. We conducted a number of interviews, and we rarely found any government official who argued that major changes were needed to the federal acquisition regulations. Generally speaking, what was needed is to use the flexibility afforded by the federal acquisition regulations to buy in the as-a-service model. The FAR is flexible enough to allow agencies to acquire as a service. However, acquisition officials need to be educated and understand how to take advantage of the flexibility afforded in the FAR. The second recommendation is that the government needs to establish policies and processes and provide fiscal incentives and rewards and support for agencies as they take steps into the cloud. We all know that people respond to economic incentives, and in government it's all about the budget. Adopting new technology can be difficult, and its transition to the cloud will require investment of time, resources, and motivation. And to the extent that incentives can be, financial incentives can be provided to do that, we'll move faster. We further recommend infrastructure improvement. Government and industry need to understand and embrace the modernization of the broadband infrastructure and the current move to IPv6 to improve the bandwidth and reliable connectivity that are necessary for the growth of cloud services throughout the United States. And finally, we move on to education and training. We recommend that government, industry, and academia cooperate to develop and distribute the educational resources for major stakeholder communities on the technical, business, and policy issues related to acquisition, deployment, and operation of cloud services. Transitioning to the cloud required new capabilities for business and agency leaders, acquisition, and IT workforces. We believe the necessary education programs can be delivered through existing resources within government, industry, and academia. A GSA-enabled cloud educational portal, new academic courses for the IT workforce, informal outreach networks among government, industry, and academic community. All these educational and training suggestions and more should be relatively expedient and easy to deploy. So that brings us back again to the buyer's guide. You notice in the 14 recommendations we've made, what we've left out are a lot of very specific ideas and actions that we believe the federal government can take to more rapidly move to the cloud and remove the impediments that prevent rapid adoption of the cloud. And we'd like to urge you all to take advantage of the website and go look specifically at that buyer's guide, which are embedded the collective experience of 70 or more companies in selling cloud services both to the government and in the commercial enterprise. So with that, let me turn it back over to Michael. And
Great. Phil?
Yes. Let me thank again the Commission leadership and all the commissioners for the fantastic work here. We're going to transition now to a question and answer session with our friends from the press. As we do so, the simulcast remote sites in Texas and Silicon Valley will turn those off and turn their attention with local commissioners and local press. We'll turn our attention here in the room to questions from the press. We do ask simply that you identify yourself and your news organization, and our first priority are questions from the press. If after we have exhausted our friends in the press with questions, I'll leave it to Mr. Capellas on whether he wants to take some other questions folks may have in the room. So with that, let me turn it back over to Mr. Capellas and ask for questions from the press.
Okay, thanks, Phil, and thanks, Dan and Jim. So the floor is now open. Yes, sir.
Gentlemen, Wyatt Cash with AOL Government. I'm sure you're familiar with the efforts at NIST to put together best practices, a site to catalog many of these efforts. How would you distinguish what you've published today from what NIST has published year to date?
Okay, so a great question, and I'll throw a couple of opening comments, and then in the spirit of collaboration, anybody on the panel who would like to take a crack at it. So philosophically, we obviously had NIST at the table, and their leadership came and actually previewed the recommendations and were actively participated. We took a look at, a lot of the good work that's been done, not only at NIST, but across the board, whether that's with SCAP all the way through FedRAMP, and said, are there application, if, we've already made recommendations that we want to, ensure that we have configuration management all the way down, that we make sure that we have, process for putting metrics around software measurements, which are embodied in some of the programs. And so the starting point was leverage good work that has been done. I think it is the collective wisdom of the panel that there has been, some really superb work done, and that we should extend and accelerate, but don't look to try to reinvent where we don't need to. And that was the basis of it. So there was active collaboration with NIST, their leadership. There was foundational looks at the work that's already been done, and there was an attempt to extend it.
If I can add to that, this is Mike Nelson with Georgetown. I've been very supportive of what they're doing at NIST. I think it's incredibly important that we have specific case studies to show just how agencies are adopting the cloud. What we're doing, I think, is providing some guidance on how policies and regulations might be changed so that those case studies aren't so difficult. And that's what they're finding with some of those case studies, is that there are barriers, there are problems, there are standards issues, there are policy regulation issues. We're giving some guidance on how to get past those. But I think that the two efforts fit together perfectly. We're providing a political push and some vision about where we can go. They're providing specifics on what needs to be fixed.
And I would commend NIST, not only in general for their work, but also for the just extraordinary collaboration they had with our effort here. So it was definitely hand in hand. Thanks, Mike. Yes, sir.
Hi, Pat Thibodeau, Computer World. I actually have two questions, but I'll just ask one now. Regarding regarding taking data and moving it overseas.
Yep.
The trend in government right now has been to ask cloud providers to ensure that the data remains in the U.S. That's both from the state and local government and federal. So you're talking about something called appropriate data that could be moved over. Can you explain just what kind of data that can be moved overseas by the government, why they should even bother doing this? You're framing it in a way that makes it seem like this is a benefit to the industry, not really to the government. And so just put a little clarity around that.
Well, first place, again, I'll give an opening comment and certainly have participation in the group. Let's start at the possible highest level of when you think about, one, obviously we live in a global environment. Secondarily is that when you look at different kinds of applications, you look at different workflows. If you're trying to take, in its simplest form, a price catalog and publish it so anybody can subscribe to it and be able to see a price catalog, that is a workflow which would naturally want to open up to its broadest possible barriers. If you're looking for the ability to do competitiveness on how to do global shipping, you would obviously want to open that workflow up to as many global partners as you can. If you're interested in keeping individual records relevant to health benefits or the health case of a certain individual, you may have a different set of standards. So, foundational view of the cloud is that workflows are not created equal. They are subject to different audiences, and the ability to not try to treat them all as one. And the workflow is directly related to the data underneath it. So closing your borders into saying everything looks as a single entity and all pieces of data have the same level of access is, quite frankly, not very pragmatic. So the example says is let us maximize those workflows. And Ben Franklin used to have this great saying, unfortunately, sense isn't common. By applying common sense to what some of those workflows are, we're able to have the maximum benefit of a broad distribution of these cloud applications, but also using common sense, we're able to isolate the more specific controls where they should be isolated. So I'll pass any other comments. Dan, perhaps you have a comment?
Yeah, Mike gave a good setup. I think what we're really trying to say is don't equate physical location solely as the only metric of security. It is a critical component for some things, but it is certainly not the only attribute. And one needs to look at the sensitivity of the data and the whole set of multi-factor security issues that protect data, and physical location is only one, and match the location, the security to, as Michael said, the dissemination and access and sensitivity of the data. And I think that's common sense, as he said, that would apply in any context. The related issue is one of how do we ensure that U.S. companies remain competitive in this space? Because I think all of us on the Commission felt that clouds are a place where the U.S. has an international competitive edge, and we want to work to identify those areas where we can continue to make sure that's the case. And so in the sense of saying, as we look at government data, if we want to be able to host the data of other governments in U.S. clouds, we need to lead by example. And we being the royal we, all of us, not just the government, need to lead by example. And so it's really being nuanced and understanding the nature of the workflow and the data and the expectation that we can't expect other governments to do for their non-sensitive data what we're not willing to do for our non-sensitive data.
Certainly not to break at the lowest common denominator. Okay, other questions?
Hi, Julianne Francis with Bloomberg News. Early on in the report, you make a comparison to the importance of cloud compared to the internet or the web. And I'm wondering, I'm kind of interested in the basis for that comparison, if you can talk a little bit about the analogy and based on the current situation, what led you to kind of make that comparison?
Well, the comparison is that here is I'll give you somewhat of a evolutionary answer here, and definitely phone a friend from some help from my colleagues. So we sort of have a little history lesson here. If you think about what the foundation back in 2003, 2004, when we were first able to make the internet real and broadly accessible, you had the foundation step was the broad adoption of IP networks. So when we said we were going to broadly adopt IP networks, we said we didn't have to know or care where the physical underlying infrastructure was underneath it, but by writing to an IP level, we then could make, the network available to lots of people, and every application developer didn't have to think about, well, gee, how do I write to that network? Pretty soon we didn't care where routers or switches are. We opened the network, which was followed by 3 to 4 years of incredibly rapid technological advancement. The extension of devices to the edge of the network, the movement of data, voice, and video over networks, broadband acceptance, and so that kind of blew out. The fundamental thinking of a cloud is you don't have to know or care where all the physical underlying components are. You don't have to know where servers, storage, or networks are, and you can write to a single layer, causing, again, an explosion of rapid adaptation of applications and another level of innovation. So you can see that not only just by adoption rates, but also just the underlying principles. And if you think about it, you don't have to know or care where all that hardware is. You don't have to write every application specific. It opens the world to a far greater usage. I mean, just think of the practical application of the cloud today. I mean, you're thinking of hundreds of millions of users on social networks that can, so the cloud is actually already here. The distribution of video. So the analogy we have, it's just the natural evolution of technology. The cloud is the output of 5 or 6 years of coming together, and so we don't have to know or care where the physical infrastructure is. And we do believe that it launches just another level of massive innovation and productivity. And by the way, one does not have to look around. You're probably all using dozens and dozens of cloud-based applications today. That's why you can buy an app for $2, right?
If I can add to that, Michael, I think I wrote the first draft of that particular paragraph, and it was much improved because of this collaborative process. But we had at least 4 different analogies in mind. The first was the web wasn't some niche application. It's fundamentally changed the way we used IT, and the cloud will be similar. The second is that the real impact is not going to be in our industry, although this industry is going to be changed. The real impact of the cloud is going to be in all types of companies, all types, all levels of government, and the nonprofit and academic sector as well. The third point was that the government was an early adopter of the web. And it was very important that the White House, the federal agencies, state and local governments got out there and started using the web to provide information to citizens. And that was a validation that that was a useful technology. And it generated a lot of buzz and pushed adoption faster in this country than almost any other country. But perhaps the most interesting analogy is that in the 90s, when the Congress and the White House were making policy for the web and for e-commerce, in many cases, they made a conscious decision not to do something. They didn't impose early restrictions on privacy or try to write a universal law on spam, or there were a lot of places where government did not take action. And that was very important because it allowed the private sector to come forward with multiple solutions to problems that citizens had, whether it was security, privacy, even spam. I mean, we've dealt with spam in many cases because of filters and technology, not because there's some law that's really been effective globally. So those were 4 different places we made the analogy, but the point is this is a very important seismic shift. It's as important as the web, if not more important, and it's developing at least as fast as the web did in the 90s.
I have one more point on that.
Oh, please.
So my colleagues gave excellent points, and there's one more to consider, which is, in fact, that it's web-scale computation. So the development of this kind of technology was driven by the kinds of scale that you've seen in the emergence of the internet. And what's really interesting about it, in fact, is the elastic computation. So you have sort of the scalability of your computation as a service. And so what's happened is as this was developed to address large audiences in the web, it's now being taken into other sectors and applications with a number of the characteristics that Mike pointed out, or the 2 Mikes.
Other questions? And Phil, if you had any remotely, we'd also like to address that audience if possible.
Thanks for letting me ask another question.
Yeah, you have a future as a financial analyst, right? It's a multi-part question.
You mentioned that you don't think the changes to procurement are needed. But I want to point out something. Vivek Kundra just recently made some comments that he said that we almost have an IT cartel within federal IT that's made up of very few companies that benefit from government spending because they understand the procurement process better than anyone else. It's not because they provide better technology. So he's very critical of how companies sell to the government. He says, you know, the incumbents have a huge advantage. They understand the process. Now, the cloud industry is producing a lot of new upstarts. I mean, Amazon is one of the most recognized companies. And so I don't quite get where you're saying where no changes to the procurement process are needed when you have the federal CIO saying that the current system is overwhelmingly favoring the big defense contractors, a lot of the big IT vendors, and it's really excluding the smaller and mid-sized companies from having a fair shot.
Okay, so let's back up here. We are not saying that we don't think that there's changes needed to the procurement. What we are saying is there have been through OMB 300 and a few other initiatives some movement to start to do reform and changes to that, and we encourage those to not only be extend out, to not only continue, but also to accelerate. There's no question, and it's a very practical thing. If you look at the traditional way that procurement is done within the federal government, it is in fact not only done to the incumbent supplier, but also to the incumbent technology, and there isn't a barrier to adoption of new technologies. If you want to buy a cloud service, but every benchmark is I bought a server, storage, network services, then I don't know what a unit of compute is, and yet you could, through the normal policies and practices, actually miss a whole generation. Secondarily is you notice that we have very clearly identified as a recommendation the process of adding incentives and other forms to allow those traditional procurement processes, people who are early adopters, not to sort of say, I save money, therefore I lose budget, but I save money there I can reinvest in other ways to provide incentives. So if I think you would break us down into 3 places. One is we do believe that procurement does need to change. We want to encourage you know, the efforts that have been done to try to make those reforms, because some good efforts have started. And then we do think that not only that there has to be at the agency level, but across agencies, both changes in the procurement methods, but also in the incentives of what happens on the annual budget grant.
If I could add to that, I think the specific recommendation talked about federal acquisition regulations as opposed to the process of acquiring. And I think the issue early on, the question arose early on about whether there were fundamental problems in the acquisition regulations that made it difficult to buy as a service. And I think the conclusion of the Commission was that that wasn't necessarily an impediment, that the flexibility in the regulations existed for acquisition officials to be able to buy as a service rather than buying more traditional IT. And that, for example, we know that the traditional IT thinks about buying IT as capital, not necessarily as a service, and that the ability of vendors, large or small, to offer solutions sometimes depends on the extent to which they can recover their investment over the life of the contract. The federal acquisition regulations allow acquisition officials to structure contracts in a way to provide that ability and incentive for people to offer a solution as a service rather than a more traditional mode. So I think in the recommendation was really in the context of whether there are specific aspects of the regulations themselves that need to change, to which we don't believe that's the case. We believe it's more an issue of encouraging acquisition officials to take advantage of the flexibility in the regulations to buy as a service rather than a traditional model.
And the practices are the ones that need to change. By the way, Vivek himself, you know, when we had an opportunity to debrief with him, believed that this was one of the most fundamental ones, is that the practice itself had to change in the adoption, and then it was more the cross-organizational and also the annual budgetary process that needed to change.
Well, let me maybe pick up on that a little bit, because I think this point warrants discussion in the broad context of the report. In many ways, I think one of the ways you can view all of these recommendations is addressing the issues that arise when technological change drives and requires cultural change. And here, cultural change is in the nature of how one acquires and provisions service as opposed to facilities, which is what Mike was talking about. It relates to the culture about procurement, and it relates as well, it's not just about government, it's about providers too. The culture and process by which the providers engage with that, the way that they work with government to define those processes, companies large and small, the issues around security, around privacy, around transparency, are all about trying to create mechanisms and a dialogue to drive that change in culture that will lead to the uptake of that technology, both in government and in the private sector.
And that's why probably one of the last recommendations, one of the most important, is that we also focus on education. Other questions?
If I can just add to that point, Michael.
Oh, please.
It seems to me that as you look at the 14 recommendations, in many cases we're touching on issues that we've been working on for 20 or 25 years in internet policy. And in general, with the cloud, these issues like privacy and transnational data flow are now twice as difficult because it's more global, more people involved, more different issues, but they're 5 times more important. Because we're not just talking about communication, we're talking about computing. The good news, I think, in procurement is it actually becomes easier because buying services, buying these cloud services will provide more flexibility. We won't need so many rules and regulations that we have today for buying systems. It's a very different paradigm. It'll be much more akin to buying electricity, which is not something that generates huge stacks of rule books. But we have some real challenges here. The good news, I think, is the cloud is pushing us to take action to fix some things that have been broken for a long time.
Can I just add one thing to that, which is the innovation point that's come up a lot, that when all this infrastructure is out, a small operator can come with a good idea and he can scale up quickly. And that's tremendous. Before, he needed a lot of capital really to get in the game. And that also gives flexibility to the government folks where they might have a smaller idea but couldn't really do the big investment beforehand, but now they could demonstrate it and then scale it smoothly. It's a much faster research and product development cycle. So that's something to note as well.
Hi, my name is Brendan Sasso. I'm with the Hill newspaper.
Yep.
And so I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit more about the challenge of data security with cloud computing. And I see one of the recommendations is for a national data breach notification law, and I'm wondering what's important to be in that law, what shouldn't be in the law to ensure innovation within the industry, but still having trust from people. And I know that some of the Democrats want more privacy as part of the law, and Republicans want to focus on sort of financial information and whether that makes any difference for cloud computing.
Well, I think I will stay out of the which side is which, and so we're going to probably have multiple contributions here, so I'll make a quick opening comment, and then everybody else can jump in. As foundational level, the issue of transparency in the reporting of breaches is that a company who you trust to have the services should put up front what its operating procedures are, what metrics it has, what formulates and its capabilities. But whenever there's a problem, that it should be as forthright as possible in describing what it was, what happened, what the root cause was, and so everybody gains. And trust is about understanding. So this is again one of those common sense practices that says, if I know what you're measuring, I know how you measure it, and you give me what you measure, and when you have a problem, you tell me what it is, what you did to fix it, and what are you going to do to make sure it doesn't happen again. Well, again, law of common sense applying here. That's really the practice that's in place here, which is really no different to some degree than you would think about regulation in the financial industries or a big utility. So at its premise, that's what's important to do. Privacy comes as a question then of looking at the individual workflow and saying, for which workflow, what are you going to adopt to which policies, and being able then to have a policy driven that says under certain classes of applications, I'm going to apply one set of rules, and under a second set of applications, apply a different set of rules because they're not as important because it's more open data. And so again, the which ones at which place at what level, the technical detail is extensive, but the principles are pretty clear. And there's nothing more powerful than sort of saying, here's what happened and why it happened.
Yeah, I was going to draw an analogy with the lessons learned from product recalls, which is really you act expeditiously, you be completely transparent, and you take clear action rapidly. And that's really what this is saying, that if there is a breach, and some breaches are inevitable, that's the nature, nothing is absolutely secure, that one make that notification clearly and empower the individuals affected to take their own action as well. The other aspect, remember, in that recommendation that's also worth noting is empowering law enforcement and the providers of services to take action against those who are if it's a case of a criminal breach. There certainly can be cases where breaches occur due to accidents, malfeasance, or bad operating behavior. But there's another aspect of those issues of attacks on those facilities. And right now, many of our laws that would allow law enforcement to take action working with those providers, frankly, are antiquated. In fact, if you think about the penalties for penetrating one account versus 100,000 accounts, it's very hard right now to make clear criminal distinctions between those when, in fact, their effects on individuals are substantially different. And so the second part is empowering government as well as the cloud providers to seek remediation against the causes of those breaches in addition to the issues around notifying people of what happened.
John and Mike, do you have any comments?
I'd add one more thing to it. Again, it's on the learning loop. It's hard to fix something if nobody knows what it is. And so on the one hand, a cloud provider that's operating at a larger scale will see more problems and then be able to get the learning to work to make, to address the problems. But I think that's in that genre that we need a lot more of that from a security standpoint. But you can't necessarily have public airing of all classes of breaches because it can be detrimental at large. So there are certain kinds of areas that have to be more careful with.
It also is incredibly important that the security breach legislation be designed properly. It would be very damaging if, for instance, cloud service providers were held liable for all the mistakes that their customers might have made in installing the software that they were running on the cloud, particularly for companies that are providing infrastructure as a service, which is like just renting people a computer to use. It doesn't make any sense to hold the cloud service provider for some software bug that was created by the customer, not by the cloud service provider. Likewise, if the cloud service provider were somehow required to notify all of a company's clients that there had been a problem, that doesn't make sense because they don't have the phone numbers and the addresses and the email addresses of all the people who are using a particular company's service that's running on the cloud. So we have to design these rules carefully. We certainly can do a better job than today, where we have different state rules that are in some cases not consistent, and we also need some kind of international answer to this problem as well.
So I'll just add one more thing to that, which is, it's an important technical question to get the allocation of risk and responsibility correct in the cloud. And so we need the policy sort of ideas first, and then we need the implementations to make sure that's true so that you have proper separation.
And of course, the integration of all things happens pretty tight. You also notice that we had reference to both the forensics and the discovery that actually went part and parcel to it. But it was actually fascinating to watch the depth of discussion on this topic among 300 very talented professionals who agreed on every point.
Luckily, we were using the cloud to collaborate.
Yes, absolutely.
Let me acknowledge our time restraints here. We're at the 1 hour mark. I want to add, for clarification on this last point, that the report talks about the importance of breach as a trust enabler across all IT systems, but that also will be of great benefit to a cloud architecture and delivery system. And also, just to observe very quickly that I think there is significant consensus on the Hill about how to approach data breach. That's less about party and more about process in the two different chambers. We can talk more about that. A couple of notes before we adjourn. First of all, that many of our commissioners will be available to those of you in the press later if you have follow-up questions, but we wanted to stick to time schedule here. Others of our commissioners will be participating in a BMC-hosted panel discussion that starts next door at 3 o'clock. And last, and certainly not least, there have been a number of references to an army of professional colleagues who stood behind the commissioners in producing this remarkable work product. And I wanted to use this public opportunity to, in particular, call out a few of those. Elizabeth Grossman and Jim Rotsock at Microsoft, enormous effort. Dan Burton, a one-man gang at Salesforce. Thank you, Dan. Leif Ulstrup and the team, Eric Green and Carolyn Eichler at CSC. Emily Stempilia and Bob Wambach at VC in particular, many more, some I've no doubt forgotten to mention. Last and certainly not least, Chris Wilson from the TechAmerica Foundation staff and Jennifer Kerber, who really provided, I leaned on at least the most to provide real fuel for the effort, and she fueled that effort with her intelligence, with her energy, and with lots of Red Bull. So I wanted to say thank you publicly to them.
And I think we all want to collectively also pay tribute to Vivek Kundra for his somewhat visionary leadership in sort of starting this off. So, I mean, he did just a great job of thinking forward as well.
Great. And with that, we are adjourned. Thank you very much.